So today's topic is the American Revolution. I've already talked about the Declaration of Independence. I've talked about the events leading up to the Declaration of Independence and to the beginning of the war. Today I want to focus on the battles and how the war was won, kind of the whole sweep of the war. This is a great map that I found online that has all the major battles of the American Revolution with troop movements. So the Americans are in blue and the British are in red, the red coats. So you can see on this map the movements of the American armies, for example, when they invaded, sorry, I got it backwards. The Americans are in red and the British are in blue. I wasn't thinking. So you can see the Americans, for example, when they invaded Canada, Benedict Arnold's army moving up here, and then the British when they invaded New York, St. Leger and Burgoyne's armies here, and then you can see the middle war, the battles in the middle of the continent or the country, and then you can see the battles in the south. I'll talk about most of those in today's lecture. So if you're studying for the test and you find yourself confused about where all these battles are taking place, this map might be useful or helpful. So the war began on April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Remember, it took days or weeks for news to travel in those days. It was several days before George Washington in Virginia heard about the battles and realized that the war had begun, and he immediately left his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, for Philadelphia to join the Second Continental Congress. When he got there, I've already told you they appointed him commander-in-chief. The suggestion to make him commander-in-chief, the nomination, came from John Adams and Samuel Adams, who were cousins from Massachusetts. They wanted him because he had more military experience than the other delegates in the Continental Congress did. He was from Virginia. They thought having a Virginian might keep the colonies united, since at that moment the fighting was particularly in Massachusetts. And so he was unanimously selected. He gave a speech where he accepted the choice of becoming commander-in-chief and declined a salary. He was later reimbursed by Congress for his personal expenses in the war, but he declined a salary. Interestingly, now he didn't have an army, he had to build an army. At first, because of the prejudices of mostly of the South, but I guess to a certain extent of all Americans at the time, he didn't want black soldiers in the army and declined to let them enlist. Meanwhile, the governor of Virginia issued a proclamation, the British governor of Virginia, that is, not an American, so he's on the opposite side now, promised freedom to slaves if they would join the British. And by 1777, just a couple of years later, Washington changed his mind, and by the end of the war, black soldiers were about 1/10 of the Continental Army, kind of roughly equivalent to their percentage of the population. Now, one of the first major battles of the war took place without Washington and his Continental Army participating in it, because he was still building a Continental Army. He didn't really have one yet. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. So it took place on June 17, 1775, and it took place actually on a hill called Breed's Hill, but it's been misremembered as Bunker's Hill. So what happened here was the British, remember, occupied Boston. They had a few thousand soldiers there. And Americans, in the middle of the night, placed cannon on top of Breed's Hill, and Breed's Hill was overlooking the city of Boston. The British immediately realized they had to dislodge those cannon. They had to take the hill. Otherwise, they would have to evacuate the city because the cannon could just fire down upon them at will. So the next morning, the British lined up 2,400 soldiers, and they launched 3 assaults trying to take the American position at the top of the hill and capture the cannon. Americans repelled the first two assaults and ran out of ammunition during the third one and were forced to retreat and surrender the hill. This was an interesting battle because if you've ever heard the expression about waiting to fire until you can see the whites of someone's eyes, this is the battle where that expression came from. The American in charge realized his soldiers were very low on ammunition, and that was really the only reason they lost the battle, or at least they would have held out a lot longer if they hadn't. And so he told his soldiers that, wait until you can see the whites of their eyes so they wouldn't waste any shots. Another interesting thing about the battle is the British suffered twice the number of casualties that the Americans did, over twice as many. And a disproportionate number of those casualties were British officers. Here at the very beginning of the war, you saw something interesting. Americans would often single out the British officers and aim at them rather than the ordinary guys, on the reasonable theory that if we take out the officers, then that ends the battle a lot sooner. And this seems to have had an effect on General Howe, H-O-W-E, who was in charge of the British that day. For the next year or two of fighting, and you'll see this especially when we get to New York, he seems to have been a bit timid, maybe even demoralized after the victory at Bunker Hill, because the victory cost him so much in men and officers that he seemed reluctant to attack in other situations where he perhaps could have ended the war sooner. There's one you'll see where maybe he could have even captured George Washington, which would have ended things very quickly. So George Washington arrived on July 2, 1775. So this is a couple of weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So the Patriots are the Americans, we sometimes call the Americans who supported the British Loyalists. The Patriots were surrounding the city of Boston. It was under siege, basically. The British controlled the city, and they could go in and out on ships through the harbor. But the Americans controlled the surrounding cities and countryside. But the new army was basically militia. It was badly armed. It was badly outfitted. It was completely undisciplined. And the first thing Washington had to do was try to turn it into an army. So he started drilling the soldiers, imposing discipline, including flogging or whippings, which was common discipline back in those days for soldiers and sailors, as well as many other situations, and incarceration. So he had to try to whip the army into shape. At one point, I don't remember exactly when, but I think it was in early 1776. So after the Battle of Bunker Hill, Boston is still under siege. Declaration of Independence hasn't been issued yet. An American general named Henry Knox arrived at Boston with cannon that he had captured at Fort Ticonderoga in northern New York. And he had dragged the cannon 100 miles or more, hundreds of miles, all the way to Boston. Well, they set the cannon up on top of hills overlooking the city of Boston, and they started bombing the city, the ships and the British harbor. And the British realized it was hopeless, it was defenseless. They couldn't stay there with the Americans just bombing away at their ships with impunity. And so in March of 1776, the British retreated. They abandoned the city of Boston and they left. And Boston was in American hands for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1775, the Continental Congress ordered an invasion of Quebec. Quebec is now a Canadian province, French-speaking province. It's just north of New York and Maine in the northeastern United States. And so the Congress had hoped that the French-speaking people in Canada would be sympathetic to our cause, and that as the Americans arrived in Quebec, maybe they wouldn't even have to fight much, right? And the reason for that, they hoped that, was because the French and the English had been enemies for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they thought maybe the French-speaking people in Quebec will naturally sympathize with us and just want to join our side. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The French Canadians, as well as the English-speaking Canadians, fought on the British side, and so the invasion didn't find very many allies. So the Americans arrived in two separate forces that took two different routes to get there. One was led by a General Richard Montgomery, and the other by an American named Benedict Arnold. But their invasion of Canada was cursed, you might say, from the beginning. Here, I'll show you. This is a picture of the routes taken. So this is all New York right here. And Arnold took this route via rivers towards the eastern, excuse me, just east of New York. And Montgomery took this route up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec, the city of Quebec. So like I said, the invasion was cursed from the beginning. There was an epidemic of smallpox in the American camp, which debilitated the soldiers. They didn't get there until the very end of 1775, and American enlistments were only for a one-year time. The volunteers, in other words, were all scheduled to go home at midnight on New Year's Eve, and so they were at risk of literally having their army just walk away, right? Say, we're done. We're on the verge of attacking the enemy city, but enlistments end and at midnight, we're going home. And so they ordered an attack, Montgomery did, a desperate attack at Quebec on December 31, 1775. He was killed in the battle. Benedict Arnold was wounded. 400 Americans were taken prisoner. Congress sent reinforcements, but they also suffered an epidemic of smallpox. And eventually, the Americans were forced to retreat. They traveled back down the St. Lawrence River to Montreal and then back into New York, and they never invaded Canada again for the remainder of the war. Now, Americans have tried and failed miserably to invade Canada. The British have evacuated Boston, and everyone knew that the next target was New York City. The British were going to attack there, and the Americans expected an attack there. And so Washington arrived in New York City on April 13, 1776, to prepare to defend the area. Interestingly, when he got there, there was a plot to assassinate him or capture him that was discovered. His own bodyguard was a part of the plot. The mayor of New York was a part of the plot. There were many people in New York City who were loyal to the British throughout the war. In fact, there were so many that when New York City eventually did get captured by the British, there were celebrations, like the British had liberated them from these American rebels. Right? But the plot was uncovered. Several people were hanged for mutiny and sedition. And then on July 4th, the Independence Declaration was adopted. And on July 9th, Washington informed his troops that they were now fighting for free and independent states. This is General Howe, who I mentioned earlier. And this is a map of Staten Island and Long Island and some of the fighting and troop movements that went on during the time. So the British began arriving on Staten Island on July 2, 1776. And they outnumbered the Americans considerably. General Howe had 32,000 soldiers, British Army regulars and German mercenaries called Hessians. He had 427 warships with 10,000 sailors and 1,200 cannons, which was the largest military seaborne expedition in history up to that point. When he arrived at Staten Island, he sent word to the Americans offering them a royal pardon if they would seize the war effort, and they refused the offer. And then the fighting began. So in August, Howe landed 20,000 troops in Brooklyn and then approached Washington's fortifications. Washington decided to try to defend Brooklyn, probably because he had bad information about the size of Howe's army. He thought Howe had only 8,000 troops as opposed to 20,000 or so. Washington's army was very poorly trained, somewhere around 19 or 20,000 soldiers, but they were still badly equipped and badly trained. Washington himself was a veteran of frontier fighting, but that was fighting against Indians in the woods, nothing like fighting against trained British soldiers and European-style engagements. He had no experience commanding a large force or artillery, so he was really outmatched, you might say. The British had far, far more experience than he did. So in the Battle of Long Island, Howe assaulted Washington's flank. The British suffered only 400 casualties, the Americans 1,500, and Washington was forced to retreat. They managed to successfully retreat to Manhattan Island. An American general named William Alexander held off the British for Washington and his army to escape. And here's where I said something about Howe maybe being timid. There are those who think that if Howe had aggressively followed Washington to Manhattan and attacked him there, he might have captured him, because the American army was so untrained, so disorganized at this point, they really didn't know what they were doing yet. But Howe was kind of timid. He would kind of fight a little bit and then watch and let Washington retreat, and sort of plotting instead of really aggressive and forceful. So Washington retreated. Then the Royal Navy bombed Manhattan Island. Washington tried to defend it. Howe landed his troops on Manhattan in November and captured the city and inflicted high casualties on the Americans. The Americans were forced to abandon New York altogether, and the army retreated to White Plains in New York, which is north of Manhattan. I mentioned this earlier, but there were many loyalists in New York who considered Howe a liberator. That Howe remembers the British general. And they celebrated the British arrival. Patriot morale was now very, very low after abandoning Manhattan. Washington's army was reduced to about 5,400 troops because of desertions and people leaving when their enlistment time was over. And his army gradually retreated through New York, through New Jersey, and then south towards Delaware. At this point, it's the end of 1776. Washington has failed to defend New York and has been retreating throughout the year, the second half of the year, from the British Army. And Washington faced a crisis. By December 1776, he had only 3,000 men left. Remember, in the middle of that year, he had about 19,000. So the army they've just been deserting and leaving because it's so disorganized and hopeless. Howe, in December of 1776, decided to go back to New York City and wait there until the winter was over. He left a small British army posted in Trenton, New Jersey, and another small force nearby in Princeton. And he expected that the fighting was over, because in those days, traditionally, you just didn't fight that much during the brutal winter conditions. You set up camp and waited for spring, and then you could resume your military campaigns. But Washington knew he needed a victory. If he didn't have some kind of victory before the year was over, his troops would just go home. They would decide not to re-enlist. They were just getting beaten time after time by the British. All they were doing was retreating. And so Washington decided to launch a surprise attack. So on Christmas night, December 25th, 1776, he led 2,400 men on boats from Pennsylvania across the Delaware River into New Jersey. And that's where this famous painting is commemorated. He personally risked being captured by crossing on ahead to the New Jersey shoreline and kind of staking out the terrain. His men followed behind him in big boats with 40 men per boat. And they landed at 3 a.m. on December 26th with no losses. Then they marched to Trenton. The march itself was brutal. 2 men died from exposure to the cold. It was blizzard-like conditions. There was sleet and snowfall. But they arrived at Trenton and launched a surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton. Remember, the Hessians are German mercenaries. And they caught the Hessians completely by surprise and captured something like 850 of them, killed 22, and captured a lot of the army supplies as well. Actually, I think they captured about 1,500. Something about 1,500. No, they surprised 1,500 and they captured about 850. Sorry. One interesting little side note about this, just to give you some color to the story. Remember, it's Christmas Eve when they cross the Delaware River and the morning of December 26th when they attack. Back in those days, many people celebrated Christmas a lot differently than we do today. It was common to celebrate Christmas by having a big party and getting wasted. And the Germans were celebrating, and Germans were famous for drinking beer anyway, right? Still are. So the Germans were celebrating Christmas with a lot of enthusiasm. They were having a great time, and they were getting just drunk. And at some point, somehow, I don't know how, someone had gotten word that the Americans were coming. Someone had seen something, and someone handed a note to the guy in charge of the Hessians, and the guy was too busy having fun, and he folded the note and he put it in his pocket and he said, "Don't bother me," and he just kept drinking. And his body was found the next day, the note's still in his pocket. He hadn't opened it up to read it, and it said something like, "The Americans are attacking." So don't get drunk on Christmas. I guess the morale. So a week later, they launched another surprise attack, this one on Princeton, New Jersey. Here, there was another success. These were British soldiers, not Hessian mercenaries. 40 Americans were killed or wounded. 273 British soldiers were killed or wounded in this attack. So these 2 attacks were not major military victories in terms of changing the strategy of the war or outcome of the war in any way. What they did was they gave Washington's army a boost of morale at a crucial time when it felt like they weren't winning, right? They had not had any victories, and this gave them a victory to give them the courage to keep fighting. So with these 2 battles, the Americans decided to stop for the winter. They went to Morristown, New Jersey, and you'll see a pattern that starts to develop. The winter was brutal and awful. They were ill-equipped. They didn't have enough food. Disease was rampant, and Washington only had 1,000 soldiers left at the end of that winter. Now let's get this one. In 1777, the Americans began to get help from Europeans who were hearing about the revolution, who were excited about the ideals in the Declaration of Independence and in other documents in the revolution. And a lot of these Europeans began volunteering. They crossed the Atlantic, which took a lot of time and a lot of expense, and they showed up and volunteered to join Washington's army and help the Americans. Probably the most famous one is this guy to Washington's left, our right in the painting, and that is Lafayette. He is a really interesting character. He arrived in 1777 in Philadelphia. He was only 20 years old, but he was a French officer with several years of military experience. He arrived because he was excited about the principles in the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. and he offered to serve for no pay if Washington would make him a general. Initially, Washington was reluctant to make someone so young a general, even though he had more experience than probably any of the Americans there, maybe even including Washington. But Lafayette served in a battle at Brandywine just a few months later, and he fought with such distinction that Washington gave in and said, yeah, you're the best I've got, you're a general. And he was at Washington's side for the rest of the war, became close friends with him and one of his best generals. Another interesting person is von Steuben, Baron von Steuben. He was a German, and his role was training the American soldiers at Valley Forge. And he is credited with finally turning some of the raw, undisciplined American soldiers into capable fighters. And I'll talk about Valley Forge in a little bit. These are another couple of interesting volunteers, Thaddeus Kashusko and Casimir Pulaski. These were Polish nobles. The guy on the left, Kashusko, was a Polish engineer, and the guy on the right led American cavalry units during the war. There were a lot of Poles who were excited about the American cause. Their country was routinely invaded and conquered and occupied by Germany and Russia, and so they admired the American cause and sort of saw themselves in it and sort of were inspired by it. And so these two are two of several who came over to help. Another interesting guy is Baron Dekalb. He was, I think, a German, and he had an interesting role in a battle I'll talk about in a little bit, the Battle of Camden. In that role, the American general fled when the fighting got bad, and Dekalb took over and tried to rally the Americans and fight back, and ended up getting mortally wounded in the defense. And he said, I die the death I always prayed for, the death of a soldier fighting for the rights of man. These are just some of the more famous people who fought from Europe on the American side. So now I want to get to a battle that is a real turning point in the war, the Battle of Saratoga. So this took place in New York, and the British planned a three-pronged attack in New York. And the purpose of the attack was to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. The British general, John Burgoyne, was supposed to lead an army from Canada south through New York, from Lake Champlain to Albany on the Hudson River. So you have Burgoyne, and he was going to go south to Albany, along the Hudson River. And then you had a guy named Colonel Barry St. Ledger. He was going to cross New York from Oswego and Lake Ontario in the west towards Albany. So he was coming from Canada too, but he was going to come from the western part of New York over around where Buffalo is today, and he was going to converge on Albany from that direction. And then General Howe, who was occupying New York, was going to lead a third army from New York City north to Albany. So these three British generals were all going to conquer New York, reaching Albany from three different directions. And the idea is we will control the Hudson River, we will control New York, and we will cut off the New England colonies up here from the Atlantic colonies like Pennsylvania and Delaware down here. And essentially they figured they would cut the colonies in half, and that would weaken the rebellion. And the plan failed miserably, and you'll see why. So Barry St. Ledger was defeated trying to advance to Albany and never even made it to Albany. There was a major battle called the Battle of Oriskany, and here the Patriots, the Americans, defeated the British. And two interesting things about this battle. Benedict Arnold played a role. He arrived with reinforcements to help the Patriots or the Americans defeat the British. He was sent by Washington who, when he heard about this plan, realized how serious the threat was and sent Benedict Arnold up to help the American forces there. Another interesting thing is a lot of the fighting that defeated St. Leger at the Battle of Oriskany was fighting between Iroquois Indians. Half of the Iroquois Confederacy had decided to side with the British during this war, and half with the Americans. And so this was one of the most brutal, deadly fights in Iroquois history, with them fighting each other. And some accounts I've read, they never really recovered, kind of politically or socially, from this Iroquois Civil War. So the Americans won, and St. Leger was stopped, and his advance failed. Then General Howe, for some reason, in September of 1777, decided not to follow the plan. Instead of taking his army up the Hudson River to Albany, he decided to go south to Philadelphia. Well, when Washington and Lafayette realized that Howe was threatening Philadelphia, they rushed to try to stop him. They were defeated badly at the Battle of Brandywine, and then Howe was able to march into Philadelphia unopposed and take over the city. Remember, at that point, Philadelphia was the capital. That's where the Continental Congress met. So the Congress had to flee and escape from the British, and this was another major defeat for Washington and his forces. This is the battle where Lafayette was shot, I think in the leg. I don't remember where exactly. But he distinguished himself. He fought with great bravery, and Washington made him his right-hand man ever since. So Howe occupied Philadelphia for the rest of the winter of 1777 and 1778, and Washington set up camp nearby at Valley Forge. Now, General Burgoyne was left on his own, and he's the guy who was following down the Hudson from Canada through Lake Champlain, and then he was going to go through these woods, this heavily forested area of New York, and he was supposed to reach Albany down here. But as you can see on this map with the red dotted lines, he never made it to Albany. A couple of things went wrong. A lot of things went wrong. Well, first of all, the plan was already kind of foiled because St. Leger had been stopped and Howe had never even tried. So Burgoyne was on his own. Another problem was that Burgoyne had a strange method of campaigning in the wilderness. Remember, New York City was, the New York woods were wild. There were no roads. It was thick forests. And he campaigned he took with him 225 women and 500 children, including his mistress, he took dozens of carts full of luxury goods for himself so that he could dine and camp out with pleasure during this military campaign. And because he was literally carrying so much useless baggage, it was harder than it should have been for the British to get through these heavy, unpaved woods. The Americans made it worse. Thaddeus Kashusko, the Polish guy, had a group of men that cut down trees, dammed streams. Wherever there was a bridge that might help the British advance, they destroyed the bridge so the British would be slowed down. They did everything they could to make the British advance from here to Saratoga as slow and painful as it could be. So when the British finally reached Saratoga, they were low on food and they were running out of supplies. To make it even worse, thousands of Americans, volunteers, militia, had come out of all the surrounding New York and Vermont towns and had converged upon them so that the Americans now outnumbered Burgoyne's army. The British fought for 3 weeks in the Saratoga region against Americans. They fought at battles like Bemis Heights and Bennington before they were finally forced to give up. Interestingly, Horatio Gates is the guy on the right here. He was the general ostensibly in charge of the American forces at Saratoga. But the guy on the left, Benedict Arnold, is the person that many Americans at the time and many historians think really deserves the credit for defeating Burgoyne in the British Army. Arnold, according to his contemporaries, was the cause of the American success at a battle called the Battle of Freeman's Farm, where the British suffered over 600 casualties. But for some reason, Horatio Gates couldn't stand Benedict Arnold, and when Gates wrote an official report of the battle, he refused to even mention Arnold's name. So you had kind of a personality issue here. In fact, Gates relieved Arnold of command for some reason. And so the next major battle in the Saratoga region was the Battle of Bemis Heights. And here, Benedict Arnold started off the battle in his tent. He had been relieved of command. He was angry at Gates, who refused to give him any credit for his earlier victory. And he was sitting in his tent as the battle raged, and initially the Americans were doing very poorly. Arnold heard that they were doing poorly, got more pissed off at the thought of losing the battle than, being slighted by General Gates. So he emerged from his tent. He kind of took control of the American forces, won the battle for the Americans, suffered a broken leg during the battle, but kept fighting, and eventually they won the Battle of Bemis Heights. He had to retire from the fighting at Saratoga at that point, still not getting any credit from Horatio Gates for his exploits. So he went to Philadelphia, and he was in Philadelphia to recover from his injury. And while he was there, he began corresponding with British secret agents. And what seems to have happened was he was angry at Gates, maybe angry at Washington too. He was angry because the Americans weren't giving him any of the credit for the victories he was winning on their cause. And so he got involved in a plot to get himself appointed command of West Point, which was an American fort, now is an American military school in New York, and to hand over the fort to the British. The plot was discovered. Benedict Arnold was forced to flee. He ended up joining the British side and fighting on their side for the rest of the war as a general. The British guy, Major Andre, who Benedict Arnold was corresponding with, was later captured by the Americans and hanged. But they never captured Benedict Arnold. So the British were stopped at Saratoga. They had run out of food. They couldn't be reinforced. And October 17, 1777, they surrendered. 5,800 British soldiers surrendered. And this was a major turning point in the war. First of all, the British finally realized they had underestimated the Americans. One British officer said, "The courage and obstinacy with which the Americans fought were the astonishment of everyone, and we now became fully convinced that they are not that contemptible enemy we had hitherto imagined them." When the news of the loss at Saratoga reached London, the British Prime Minister William Pitt told Parliament, "You cannot conquer America." In other words, he realized right then the war was essentially over, that they couldn't win. Now, they didn't stop fighting for 4 more years, and the war wasn't officially over for 6 more years, but William Pitt knew after this battle that they had already lost. It was unwinnable. So they offered a deal to the colonies, to the Americans. They offered them full self-government if they would stay loyal to the king. Remember, that's what John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had wanted just a few years earlier. They had said, "We are and will remain loyal to the king. We just want to manage our own affairs." And now that's exactly what the British were offering them. You're on your own. You can have full self-government, tax yourselves, do whatever you want. Just say that you're still loyal to the king. But now the Americans said no. They didn't even want that deal anymore. They wanted nothing less than complete independence, because now they were winning. One of the reasons Saratoga was so important is because early the next year, the United States signed treaties with France and Spain, and France and Spain became our military partners for the rest of the war. The U.S. had been negotiating with France for a long time, and France had been quietly helping the U.S., sending military aid. But France had been reluctant to officially join the American side because they knew once they did, it would basically be a world war between them and Great Britain. They had already fought and lost such world wars recently, and they didn't want to be caught in that situation again unless they were sure the Americans could win. After Saratoga, they realized the Americans really can win this thing. It's not hopeless. And so they officially joined the war on our side. And so for the rest of the war, it was a world war. It was us fighting for our independence in America, but France fighting against Britain, and Spain fighting against Britain and other parts of the world. I mentioned that Washington and his army were at Valley Forge that winter, 1777 and 1778. This winter became infamous for how awful it was. Over about a 3-month period, the American army suffered 2,000 to 3,000 deaths from 3 to 6 month period, from cold, from disease, from lack of food, clothing, and shelter, and another 1,000 or so deserted from the army. And what made it worse is there was plenty of food available in Pennsylvania to feed the soldiers, but Congress couldn't get Washington enough money to buy the food. Meanwhile, the British were just a few miles away in Philadelphia, and they had plenty of money and plenty of supplies in Philadelphia, and they were eating and drinking and sleeping very comfortably. So it was logistic problems and economic problems that caused all the suffering. Just a few months later, the British decided to evacuate Philadelphia and return to New York, and Washington attempted to attack the retreating British at the Battle of Monmouth. The British were now commanded by General Henry Clinton, and they weren't able to inflict serious damage. What's interesting about this is this was the last battle that Washington fought in the North. After this, he realized he had a strategy in place, and the strategy was not to risk any more major confrontations with larger, better equipped, better trained British forces. Instead, avoid the main British army and carefully select opportunities to attack. And this meant he was conceding that the British controlled big cities like New York. He realized it was futile to try to dislodge them from places like New York, and he realized that the way to win the war now was to simply outlast the British. You could say he realized time was on his side. As long as he kept his army together and intact, and it survived from year to year, it was a matter of time before he would win, right? Before the British would give up and go home. At this point, around 1778, the war begins to shift to the south. The British now had lost in the New England area. They had been chased out of Boston. They had captured New York and held it, but they weren't really getting anywhere in the mid-Atlantic states, and they had suffered a major loss at Saratoga. So they tried a new strategy. What they decided to do was start fighting in the southern states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. And the reason they wanted to shift their focus to that region was they thought that there were many more American loyalists there than patriots. In other words, they thought that the people in the South were going to be on the British side. They figured that they would recruit American loyalists to fight for them, and they would win the war with Americans doing most of the fighting. That expectation turned out to be untrue. They did have a series of victories, though. They did have a lot of success initially. Their best early success was in Savannah, Georgia. Savannah is on the coast, and it fell to the British on December 29, 1778, and the Americans had 5,500 soldiers, I don't remember how many soldiers. A couple of years later, Charleston, South Carolina was forced to surrender, and 5,500 American soldiers surrendered there, and that was the greatest American loss of soldiers in the war. Another great American loss, a British victory, was at Camden, South Carolina. Have any of you ever seen an old Mel Gibson movie called The Patriot? Yeah, one of you? There's a scene in that movie where the Mel Gibson character is standing basically at his door and watching a battle in his front yard. And the British are attacking the Americans, and Mel Gibson's character says something like, Gates is an idiot, or Gates is a fool. I don't remember exactly what he says. He's talking about a real battle. The movie's fiction. But that battle really did happen, and Gates really was a fool. So that was true. What happened was, the British and the Americans lined up to fight, and the Americans put their most inexperienced militia group right here on their left flank. The British put their best cavalry group on the right flank, and when they attacked, the Americans were demoralized and fled. And the American who fled the fastest and the farthest was General Horatio Gates. You can see the little arrow of him running and running and running, and apparently he didn't stop galloping away on his horse until he was miles away. And when he did finally stop, Washington told him, "You're fired," and he was never in charge of an American army again. This is the battle where I told you that German guy, Dekalb, who was way over here, he saw that the Americans were panicking, and he took over. And they still lost the battle, but he managed to try to regain some semblance of order. He was mortally wounded in the process and died on the field. So this was a terrible defeat for the Americans. The Americans were defeated again at a place called Waxhaws in North Carolina. And this defeat was infamous because allegedly Colonel Barrister Tarleton ordered the massacre of Americans after they surrendered at this battle. And ever afterwards, the Americans remembered him as Bloody Tarleton or Bloody Band. He's also a character in that Mel Gibson movie, a true character, perhaps not quite as evil as the movie portrayed him, but he was a real person. The Americans finally got revenge at Kings Mountain in North Carolina. American sharpshooters devastated Loyalist troops. They took 700 Loyalists captive. But there are two interesting things at this battle. There were about, several hundred Americans, several hundred fighting on the British side, but the only person there who was an actual regular British soldier was the British Major Patrick Ferguson. In other words, of all the 1,500 or so people fighting, they were all born in America. But half of them were on the Patriot side, half of them were on the Loyalist side. In fact, there were about 74 sets of brothers fighting against each other, and 29 sets of fathers and sons fighting on opposite sides. So there was apparently a lot of division in North Carolina about which side people wanted to fight on. Another interesting thing about this is that at the end of the battle, a Loyalist militia group tried to surrender, and Patriot marksmen continued to shoot them, yelling Tarleton's quarters, and they were referring to the earlier battle where the British Colonel Tarleton had allegedly massacred Americans who were trying to surrender. So at this point, you begin to see something that is maybe not always appreciated. The fighting in the American South of the American Revolution was brutal. It was awful. It was brother against brother, sometimes father against son, and it involved massacres on both sides. Right? People started to hate each other so much that they committed atrocities like this. An American named Nathaniel Greene took over after Horatio Gates was fired, and he decided to fight a war of attrition. He decided to avoid large battles against British forces and instead attack quickly and retreat and fight small battles and try to keep the British off balance. The Americans were successful at Cowpens, The American in charge was Daniel Morgan, and they were able to kill 110 men and capture 700. General Greene defeated a British General Cornwallis at the Battle of Guilford. Well, I got this backward. In a sense, Cornwallis defeated Greene, but Cornwallis's men suffered more casualties than Greene's did. What Greene did was attack and then retreat. And because he retreated, Cornwallis, in a sense, won the battle because he still had the territory after it was over. But his men had suffered disproportionately. Now, at this point, the British General Cornwallis decided that he didn't like the way the fighting was going in the Carolinas. He was really being harassed endlessly by Greene and other Americans, and he decided to invade Virginia. He thought that if he got to Virginia and he could be successful there, he could cut off supply lines to the Americans in the Carolinas. So he took his army north to Virginia, and then when he got to Virginia, he was ordered by a different British General, Clinton, to go to Yorktown, which is on the coast of Virginia, and wait for resupplies. So here you can see on this map, this is Cornwallis. He had marched north through North Carolina, and he had marched into Virginia, and he had fought a little bit here in Virginia, and then he had gone to Yorktown. Now, when Cornwallis took his army to Yorktown, the Americans realized they had an opportunity. Washington and Lafayette and a French general, de Rochambeau, were way up here in North Carolina and New York City, and they realized this was a golden opportunity to trap a British army. So Washington and Lafayette and the French marched as fast as they could down to Virginia, and a French Navy set out for Yorktown at the same time. Let's see. When they got there, they surrounded the British by land and sea and basically put them under siege. The British were protected by fortifications called redoubts, and the Americans began storming these redoubts, like you see in the painting here, one by one, inching closer and closer to the city of Yorktown proper. The British were surrounded. They were cut off by land and sea. The British Navy tried to defeat the French Navy off the coast of Yorktown and were defeated in a major battle. And so the British were running out of food and supplies. They tried desperately to break out, but they failed, and they were forced to surrender on October the 19th, 1771. When they surrendered, over 7,000 British soldiers were prisoners of war, and this would be the last major land battle of the Revolution. One interesting note in history, Cornwallis was so depressed and demoralized by being forced to surrender that he refused to show up for the surrender ceremony. This is Washington over here in the background, and the guys actually conducting the ceremony, I don't remember any of their names. Cornwallis claimed he was sick and couldn't leave his tent. Everybody knew he was really sulking and didn't want to participate because he was upset. So when the British Prime Minister, Lord North is who it was, heard of the surrender at Yorktown, he said, "Oh God, it is all over," and it was. King George III decided not to send any more soldiers to America. In 1782, Parliament voted formally to end the war, and in 1783, a peace was finally signed. There are one or two last things I want to point out regarding the war. So the war is effectively over now at the end of 1781. In 1783, there's a major crisis called the Newberg Conspiracy. Washington's soldiers, his officers, are very angry They haven't been paid in years by the Continental Congress. And they're worried that with the war effectively over, a peace treaty is about to be signed, they will be unenlisted, sent home, and they'll never get their pay. Congress will just refuse to pay them. And they'll have fought for all these years for nothing in the sense of, no compensation. So they decide to start talking about marching to Philadelphia and physically forcing Congress to pay them, effectively a coup. Washington hears about it, and he's very upset, and he stops the talk immediately. He convenes his officers. He tells them to support the supremacy of Congress and not to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. In other words, he's telling them he doesn't want a military rule. He doesn't want the army taking over, capturing the city, taking over the government because it's unhappy about the pay. He ends by taking his reading glasses out, and he says he's going to read to them a letter from a member of Congress. And he takes out his reading glasses and he says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." And he was saying something without saying it. What he was saying by holding up his reading glasses and saying, "I've almost gone blind in the service of my country," is he was reminding them that he had fought as long as they did and that he had not been paid either. And apparently they were all so moved, they gave up the conspiracy like that, and it was over. Another important thing is Washington's resignation. So this is December 4, 1783. After the war is now officially over, the treaty has been signed. And on December 23, he officially hands back to Congress his commission as commander-in-chief. In other words, he resigns. Now, this might sound like it's no big deal to you. What could possibly be shocking about the commander-in-chief resigning? Many people around the world had expected him to not do that. What did they expect him to do? Declare himself king. And King George III had assumed he would do that. There was an American painter in London named Benjamin West, and George III had asked him, "What will Washington do now that the war is over?" And West had said, "Oh, they say he will return to his farm," which is what he did. King George III said if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Meaning no one in Europe, all the kings and queens and monarchs could understand that. All he had to do was say, "I want the crown." And maybe Americans would have given it because he was that loved, that popular. But he didn't. He didn't want to be a king. He didn't want to be a dictator. He wanted a civilian Republican government, and so he resigned. Just to follow up on that point, in many other parts of the world, they weren't so lucky. In Mexico, they got their independence in 1821. The general who achieved it for them became emperor, and they had unstable governments for 100 years afterwards. In South America, the same thing happened. But here, right off the bat, our example was Washington wanted a republic. He wanted a democracy. So the Treaty of Paris officially ended the revolution on September 3, 1783. Great Britain recognized U.S. independence and ceded to the U.S. land east of the Mississippi River and south of Canada. Britain agreed also to remove all of its soldiers from military posts on those lands. And so the American size was doubled, and America was officially recognized by Great Britain as a free and independent country. Now, you might wonder, why is this painting unfinished? The British were so unhappy about having to sign the peace treaty, giving up the United States, that they refused to sit for the portrait, and so it was finished without them. And that's it for today. I'll see you next time.